welcome to part 2 of this introductory video on working with autistic and neurodivergent clients. So the objectives of this session are for you to be introduced to some further autistic-led explanatory theories of autism, to reflect on how differences in sensory perception may impact on autistic experience, identify masking and camouflaging as a developmental trauma response. We're also going to learn about how therapy or other kinds of helping might inadvertently re-traumatize autistic people, and then find out what helps, what we can do differently to avoid that. And finally, we'll be reflecting on ethical maturity and integrity. So we'll begin this session by considering some explanatory theories of autism. In part 1, we looked at theory of mind, which is an explanatory theory of autism. Other non-autistic theories include weak central coherence and executive dysfunction. All of these theories seek to explain autism from the perspective of deficits, respectively, that autistics lack insight into other people's minds, that autistics see the details but fail to see the bigger picture, or that autistics' ability to plan and organize is impaired. These theories underpin the DSM-5 criteria for a diagnosis of autism from a medical deficit perspective. They're what drives much of the popular narrative around autistic people. So just think about that for a moment. The explanatory theory or theories that you hold in your head inevitably influence your approach and the goals that you would see as appropriate and the interventions you would use to support someone to reach those goals. In part 1, we looked at the double empathy problem, which explains the misunderstandings that occur between people who process the world differently, and how that's often mistaken for a lack of empathy solely on the autistic side. We also considered the neurodiversity paradigm, which describes the place of autistic people and other neurominorities in the wider society. What we're going to present here are some alternative autistic-led explanatory theories of autism, starting with intense world theory. Intense world theory is a neurobiological theory from Markram and Markram, which presents the idea that sensory and emotional processing differences in autistic people are responsible for what we recognize as autism. Emotions are seen to be sensory as well, because they're felt when your brain releases chemicals, which are processed like other sensory information. So given that autistic people have differences in sensory processing, it should be expected that there would be differences in emotional processing as well. In essence, autistic brains have a different wiring. The connectivity between neurons in the brain is different. It's hyperconnected. And this is especially apparent in the amygdala, the part of the brain that's responsible for fight, flight, and freeze responses. So, the intense world theory suggests that you too would stim, melt down, pick up special interests, and communicate differently if you perceived the world as a continuous sensory assault. However, there are a few areas in which this theory falls short. For example, some autistic people are undersensitive to many sensory perceptions, so it's harder to apply the intense world theory of autism to them. Murray, Lawson, and Lesser's theory of monotropism makes sense of many autistic experiences at the individual level by focusing on how attention is directed differently. So the link on the slide will take you to the original paper from 2005, but there are also a wealth of additional resources, including videos on the topic at the monotropism.org website. The link for that one's on the bottom, so do have a look at that too. So monotropism is a neuroaffirming theory that explains about autistic patterns of attention. So in brief, Autistics tend to have a thinking style which concentrates resources on a few interests and concerns at any time, rather than distributing them widely. That's termed as polytropism. Concentrating resources on a few interests, but quite deeply, compared to the more superficial level of attention distributed in polytropism. What this means is that this deep focus can result in autistic people missing a lot of things that other people register because they're outside of the attention tunnel. But other people probably miss just as many things, just different things. This is what Damien Milton calls a mismatch of salience. Whatever interest is most aroused in a monotropic mind tends to pull in a whole lot of processing resources. And so that naturally makes it harder to change track, thus explaining why transition is often difficult for autistic people. And this relates to executive function, which here is reframed as autistic inertia. That is resistance to a change in state. So difficulty starting, stopping, or changing direction. And this is central to many of the difficulties autistic people face in life, but it's also part of what makes autistic thinking distinctive and so valuable. The theory of monotropism also helps us to understand differences in communication and social interactions. So it's easier for autistic people to process one channel at a time. Distributing attention between multiple streams takes effort and sometimes just doesn't work at all. For example, autism is sometimes mistaken for deafness in small children. Conversely, if an input can't be tuned out, it can often be experienced as horribly intrusive.
Laurie Hogenkamp's stress adaptation theory posits that the peripheral outliers of society also have unique stress sensitivities. So it's not the stress that is the cause per se, but the reaction of the system to stress. The ways in which the body-mind prepares for a stressful environment, including amplifying sensory and cognitive experiences that create what we know of as autism. Let's unpack that a little. Hogenkamp states, about 100 years ago, we discovered that germs were the cause of disease. We also discovered scientific methods to isolate, pinpoint, and address those specific causes. When we then applied that new methodology to other issues of the time, heart disease, cancer, obesity, we started to pin blame on supposed culprits such as sunlight, fats, and germs in general. With that, we took out crucial evolutionary important stress resources, and subsequently, stress has become more impactful. And oxidative stress is the underlying mechanism for most of our chronic conditions and diseases of modern society. Autisms are a symptom of this disturbed homeostasis. The various developmental and cognitive trade-offs, the amplification of good and bad adaptations that occur mostly in specific subpopulations of the original outliers of society. The neurotypical, or the average socially oriented individual, was part of the scientific methodology of that time to be assumed good enough representation for everyone. But as we've learned, these are all huge mistakes. Using the average to represent all doesn't work, because neurodiversity is crucial for both respecting diversity, necessary for ecosystem balances, but also that diversity or initial conditions are critical for understanding the variances in outcomes. Systems science, chaos dynamics, complexity physics are necessary to understand modern diseases and disorders. But when we take a systems approach, we also need to see that diseases and disorders aren't really what they seem. They are adaptations, attempts to maintain homeostasis, and they too are merely symptoms of an entire ecosystem in jeopardy. The Autism Dialogue Approach is a neurodiversity ecosystem. We need everyone there. Yes, there's a unique place for subcultures and autism-only spaces, but in creating microcultures in dialogues with everyone there, all neurotypes, we create a micro-community which represents the whole system and moves us towards a much more natural, self-healing, regenerative condition. Laurie Hogenkamp's put together a video explaining this a little bit further. Please watch the video and come back to the slides. Thinking further about pressure to conform, what about how in Parliament and in classrooms kids sit in rows? Then how about how much we debate, compete, opinionate, argue, and fight? It's said that most people listen to reply, not to understand. Our systemic frameworks encourage opposition and polarization. We end up with so-called silos and silo mentality. So the very people we're trying to care for, and moreover, embrace and encourage in society, are being shunted around services with conflicting narratives impacting further on their well-being. The neuronormative deficit narrative from childhood is traumatizing. It would be safe to assume that fragmentation in all forms contributes to negative impact upon all people, not just autistic people, not just hypersensitive people. There are continuous efforts to rehumanize our mental health systems, for example, the open dialogue approach in certain pockets of the NHS, but this is a psychosis response and more about putting out fires. AT Autism and the Anna Freud Centre together promote the SPELL framework and an experience-sensitive approach. Time will tell if the National Autism Training Programme will create a cultural shift. Overall, we can consider a systems approach in our helping relationships, use insiderness to feel into the experience of another, but seeing trauma-fueled masking as a response to the fractured or fragmented system, rather than the individual's problem or a personal trait. Then working with that as the interface, just as in Martin Buber's Sacred Space. Sharing meanings, as Bohm suggests, means we can consider much more than normative and typical ways of communicating. What radical new ways can you think of to communicate with the other at this level?
So all the theories we've just described highlight how autistic people have sensory differences. So we're just going to spend a little more time looking at this aspect now. These differences can impact on communication and relationships as well. And a person might be under or oversensitive compared with a non-autistic experience. So hypersensitivity to input such as bright lights, noise, and smells, those are quite common. But hyposensitivity occurs as well. So a person may not notice certain inputs as strongly or not at all. And overall, it's really important to remember that these sensory differences can be impacted by other factors, such as tiredness, stress, pain, etc. And that's true for all people, autistic and non-autistic. And we need to remember that all of this can have an impact then on communication. So let's look at some specific examples on the next couple of slides. So here's a quote from Gunilla Gerland's first-person account. It's called a Real Person Life on the Outside. And Gunilla says, "My safe retreat in the world was a brown armchair. I would stare into the upholstery. I became absorbed in the brown material, in its threads, in the minute holes between the threads. Then the scratch on my soul would heal a little. I think this quote's a really important reminder that even though we might not share the sensory experience, the person is genuinely getting something really positive from what they're doing. And so the first question we should be asking is this person happy? Rather than, are they doing something useful? Are they meeting milestones? That's irrelevant. It's judging people against a set of criteria that isn't applicable to them. And so the energy put into what we're doing to help someone has to be appropriate to the goal that we're trying to achieve. So, for example, consider the huge amount of effort often put into getting a child to go to assembly, for example, which may be a horrible sensory experience. But the amount of effort put in and the distress caused, is it worth it? Additionally, synesthesia is more common in autistic people. And synesthesia is where the stimulation of one sensory modality triggers another. So, for example, seeing colours when hearing sounds, or vice versa. It's really hard to know when this is happening to someone, but it's useful to know it exists as it gives you a wider range of possibilities for explaining or understanding behaviour. We can't just ask someone though, can we? Because how do they know? How does anyone know if their sensory experience is different to someone else's? How do I know, for example, that what I see as blue is the same thing as what you're seeing?
Let's look at sensory overload, which affects 70 to 90% of autistic people. It's mostly the 5 senses, but there are other senses. The feel of things, the feel of food, touching people, hugs, proximity, and pain. In the auditory realm, intense hypersensitivity or need, for example, for white noise, inability to separate sounds, for example, background noise, multiple voices. Neurotypical people can, for example, tune into a conversation on one side of you and block it out, not pay any attention to the other conversation nearby. If you can't do this, it can be hard to hear anything. That's why visual communication might be helpful. There might be a hypersensitivity to smell. There's sensitivity in taste, texture. It can lead to restricted diets. And in the visual, often monotropic. It can be single-channeled, high level of detail being processed through one particular sense. It might lead to missing other details. Eye contact is also very sensitive in autistic people. The other senses include the vestibular, so our sense of balance, proprioception, the sense of where you are in space, what your body's doing, interoception, sensing internal signals from your body, like being hungry or when your heart is beating fast or when you need to go to the toilet, for example. Going to look at interoception shortly. Think about the added implications for social and relational overload. Interoception is an internal sensory system in which the physical and emotional states of the person are consciously or unconsciously noticed, recognized, and responded to. For example, social interaction. An increase in heart rate enhances alertness. It might mean argue, fight, or walk away. It might be felt and it might not be, and it might generate affect and it might not. This is interoceptive ability, comes on and offline depending on what state we're in. In a hypo-alert state, interoception goes offline. In a hyper-alert state, if we're overloaded, we can feel too much or nothing. That's why it's important in autism. Stressful and challenging social situations might reduce interoception by there being less attention on the internal. Trust and reliance on the interoceptive signals is even more important in order to learn from social affective experience. When we have poor interoception, it leads to weaker body signals and body awareness. And because emotions are energetic shifts which happen in the body, or interoception makes it difficult to perceive when we experience subtle shifts in emotions. Spontaneous mimicry of other people's expressions of joy is reduced in people who are socially disconnected. This might suggest there's an interoceptive dysregulation in loneliness, but these are implicit with standards and definitions of a social normal. The idea appears to be that a positive feedback loop improves well-being, which is why Autism Dialogue group work seems to be good for autistic people. In the company of people and settings perceived as safe, interoception may improve. Once one's social life starts to feel right, one can start to trust and rely on their interoceptive signals even more in order to learn from social affective experience. Autism Dialogue is mindfulness and social connection at the same time.
We're going to touch on the topic of trauma now, although this is something we will come back to in more depth in a future session. So let's start with a definition. Trauma can be defined as a negative emotional response to an adverse event. It can gridlock the brain's roads, limiting processing room for other things. It can create traumatic associations with places or words, phrases, people, or activities. In some research in 2020, Rumble et al. Found that autistic adults experienced a wide range of life events as traumatic, with over 40% in the study showing probable PTSD within the last month, and over 60% of participants reported probable PTSD at some point in their lifetime. Many of the life events experienced as traumas wouldn't be recognised in our current diagnostic systems. So this raises a real concern that autistic people may not receive the help that they need for trauma. So currently, somebody gets a diagnosis of PTSD because something has happened to them which specifically fits what's known as criterion A in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. Criterion A includes something that's involved exposure to death or threatened death, actual or threatened serious injury, actual or threatened sexual violence. And the exposure could be direct or indirect, but the event needs to be something that kind of magnitude in order for trauma to be diagnosed. However, autistic people are subject to a neuronormative deficit narrative from really early on in their life. At school, for example, even teachers may make judgmental comments about autistic children's differences. Why can't you just sit still? So autistic people are more vulnerable to traumatizing experiences, such as abuse, bullying, and othering, due to a lifelong stigma. They're subjected to comments about being weird or strange, and other microaggressions which all accumulate. This type of trauma can be described as complex trauma, CPTSD. It's where repeated experiences of trauma all accumulate and add up. So we might call it cumulative trauma. And autistic people then may experience flashbacks, dissociation, delayed emotional processing of this cumulative trauma. But these trauma responses are often then further minimized or disregarded, or the resulting behaviors are criticized. The person's told their responses are unacceptable and they need to change. So they might be told they're being overly dramatic, unreasonable, or attention-seeking, controlling, or antisocial. So this diagram shows how we all have what's called a window of tolerance. So in this window, a person is calm, regulated, the nervous system is regulated, and they're able to engage. Either side of this window are at the top a hyperarousal of the nervous system. So where arousal levels are high and we see a fight or flight response and behaviors associated with that. And to the other side at the bottom is hypoarousal, where arousal levels are low, too low. And this may present as a freeze, a fawn, or even a flop response where a person shuts down and is withdrawn or unable to engage. They may seem calm and compliant from the outside. An example of this is how young people can often be described as being just fine in school, but really they're in this hyper-aroused freeze or fawn response state. So why is this important? Well, an ongoing accumulation of traumatic experiences leads to this window of tolerance narrowing. So more and more situations are experienced as threatening. The nervous system's primed, it's ready, it's expecting a threat. And so what might seem tiny to a non-autistic person might cause a huge reaction in an autistic person. They become triggered. It could be an intense smell, light or noise. Could be the wrong food, the wrong chair, the label on a pair of trousers, or an unexpected change to plans. So just reflect for a moment on how the way in which you experience things could and does impact on the support you offer to others.
Autistic masking is a trauma response. Non-autistic literature has presented masking as a social strategy, a way of getting by or fitting in social situations. However, autistic people describe how masking is not necessarily about appearing more neurotypical. It's the trauma-fueled projection of an acceptable and expected version of yourself to those around you that keeps you safe. Masking could sometimes include the exaggeration of so-called autistic traits, depending on the context and expectations of those around the person. All in all, we can see masking as some kind of defensive shield. There's a misconception that women mask better, or that men don't mask at all. Masking can be encouraged through conditioning, compliance, and pushes to conformity. The celebration of doing all this, applauding autistics that act neurotypical because neurotypicals want us to, has been turned into social skills training and behavioral therapies. The amount of physical, emotional, and mental energy that goes into masking is phenomenal and often leads to autistic burnout.
So let's consider how therapy or other forms of helping may inadvertently re-traumatize autistic people. In general, a neurotypical therapist won't know what it's like to experience the world as an autistic person. If a person has been told all their life that they're weird or wrong, or they don't play properly or communicate properly or relate to others properly, and then in cognitive behavior therapy, they're encouraged to challenge their negative thoughts. This may feel like being told you don't think properly either, that your thinking is faulty. So can you see how this might be triggering and feel like more of the same from a society that just doesn't accept or understand you? Also, autistic people may have very different thinking. For example, they might think in pictures, shapes, colours rather than words. Alexithymia might mean it's difficult to access words for the emotions they are experiencing. They might not know how they feel. And some people have reported being described as non-engaging or being challenging or difficult during therapy when they're not able to come up with responses, for example, in answer to the question, how does that feel? And these are all examples of the double empathy problem playing out in the therapy room. Even well-meaning interventions that try to help the autistic person to become more sociable or increase their resilience can actually further traumatize the individual and invalidate their experience. An assumption that you should be more resilient or you should be able to cope with something, implies that your experience of something as overwhelming is wrong or faulty. This invalidation can lead autistic people to end up doubting their own experiences, or maybe suppressing responses out of fear of being ignored or invalidated or getting into trouble. In order to avoid being pushed into anxiety, depression, burnout, shutdown, or meltdown, autistic individuals may mask their natural autistic responses and mask their feelings. So in this way, therapy can inadvertently reinforce continued masking or fawning responses, sort of trying to appease or please others around them to avoid bullying and violence, or being routinely denied basic rights or accommodations. Autistic people have often found that masking and just giving the responses the therapist seems to want is a good way of getting by and keeping themselves safe. And this is often encouraged or rewarded in therapeutic processes. It's a kind of gaslighting, really, because therapies are built and centered on the experiences and expected responses of non-autistic people. The implications of inadvertently encouraging further masking are serious, because research from Cassidy et al. Has shown that the stress from masking is directly linked to self-harm and to suicide ideation or suicidal behaviour. So what can we do differently to avoid all this? So there's a link here on the slide to a good practice guide from Mind and the National Autistic Society, which encourages you to think about your therapeutic environment. And on the next slide, we'll present some further thoughts from autistic people.
Beware the adapted therapy trap. It's much better to take an individualized, person-centered approach, particularly when thinking about manualized, i.e. having a manual, approaches. There's sometimes a myth, or indeed a wish, amongst psychological therapists and practitioners that when working with an autistic person, the therapist puts down a copy of the standard manual or protocol and instead picks up the adapted for autism manual or protocol. This can't be the case. Psychological therapy should always be person-centered and tailored to the needs of the individual, whether they're autistic or not. When working with traumatized autistic people, remember that because most trauma happens in a relationship, it must be healed in a relationship. To do this, professionals need to create safety in the relationship. Autistic people thrive on consistency and transparency in relationships. So share the mutual plan. Don't hide things, and bring any difficulties or differences into a curious, non-judgmental discussion. Be open, and if you don't understand something, say that you don't and ask. Trauma and arousal don't usually happen in isolation of people. Because of this, co-regulation of the nervous system is essential. Your response in times of distress should include a warm, calming presence. Take time, exercise patience, and show genuine care. Be curious about different and accumulating layers of marginalization. Look up intersectionality. Remember that power is not a finite resource. Practice power with strategies through collaboration, choice, and voice. Think about the potential for changing environments rather than the autistic person always bearing the responsibility for having to develop strategies for coping, etc.
There's a quote here from a paper by Chapman and Botha from 2023. And they say that neurodiversity theory has not been formally adapted for psychotherapeutic frameworks. And it's not the role of the therapist to make systemic changes to societal organisation. Still, they say there is room for fruitfully drawing on a neurodiversity perspective for therapists working with neurodivergent people in clinical settings. Chapman and Botha suggest 3 steps. So firstly, therapy should resist default normalization. So what's seen as dysfunction needs to be reconceptualized as relational rather than individual. So the idea that dysfunction or disability is socially constructed, it's not something solely within an individual. Secondly, therapy should be sensitive to neurodivergent perspectives. So therapists need to cultivate what they call a relational humility regarding different experiences of neurodivergence and disablement. In other words, recognize what you don't know. And thirdly, therapy should consider the importance of neurodivergent acceptance and pride, the potential for disability community and culture to emancipate neurodivergent people from neuronormativity. So this is about the importance of positive identity, belonging to a group with which you associate positively. This slide has some feedback from some participants in our community autism dialogues from 2022. And we're just sharing them here to show the importance of a safe, non-judgmental space. And yet even there, it can feel incredibly difficult to know how to unmask. Building on this, Kieran Rose explains that the meeting of people who are the same, members of the same tribe, the same people, with the same cognitive style, surpasses masking. Being with other autistic people, he says, is easy. It's stress-free, blissful, it's pure freedom. Freedom to be who we want to be, to talk how we want to talk, and about whatever we want to talk about. Freedom to be who we truly are. We take off our masks and throw them away. We have no need for them. There's mutual respect for each other's differences. We mask to keep ourselves safe and to make non-autistic people feel comfortable.
So let's briefly consider what so-called talking therapies mean for autistic people. Talking's taken for granted here and now. We're using the voice and the English language. What other forms of communication can you think of? Some practical approaches to communicating with your autistic client might include providing information in advance in different forms, clearly written, photographs or video of a walk into the venue. These are easily uploaded to YouTube, and a link provided to the person in an email or a text. This provides familiarity and therefore confidence, and equalizes the power differential. Enabling communication of the other senses and other methods. So, for example, augmented and alternative communication. The autistic person might even have an assistant who speaks for them. How would that be in your practice? Think about echolalia, which is spontaneous repetition of all or part of sentences, as a verbal response. Vocal stimming, self-stimulatory exercises with the mouth and the vocal cords, such as singing, clicking, and tics. These are related to Tourette's. And we've mentioned alexithymia, which can just kick in as part of a spiky profile. Think about the dialogic mode and interconnectedness, that interrelating to the other as soon as there's contact made. These are just some more things to think about at the initial inquiry stage and preparation.
So, in summary, autistic experience perception, expression, and communication are different to the predominant neurotype, or PNT. Trauma, internalized ableism, marginalization, and stigma is caused by the mismatch of salience in relation to the predominant neurotype. So now we invite you to pause this video and choose one or more of the questions on the slide here to reflect on and make some notes for yourself. Alternatively, you may just want to reflect on the content of the presentation so far.
Here's a true story. We offer it here as an example of a true encounter. Early on in my autism discovery journey, I got a job supporting a young autistic man in his family home. On the preliminary visit, I was briefed by his aging parents before they disappeared, so now I nervously waited alone in the lounge. A long minute later, James suddenly appeared, holding his left hand out in a loose fist, looking me directly in the eyes with a kind and warm expression from under a hoodie. "Hello, Johnny." "Hello, James." I softly held his fist. The atmosphere became empathically alive and I felt cared for. The front of his hoodie was pulled up, revealing his portly stomach, which he kept looking down at and patting. I wondered, was he doing this to divert my attention away from his face, or nothing so conscious? We stood facing each other, like new friends, with what in common as yet unknown. His dad's head appeared around the door. "Excuse me, Johnny, would you like a mint?" "Excuse me, Johnny, would you like a tea? We've got mint." "Oh, mint, yes, please." "Mint tea, yes, mint tea," James echoed in a high and wistful voice, turning to look through the large window onto the snow-covered street. Now cupping my tea, I sat down on the sofa, highly curious in anticipation. Without turning round, James asked, "What were you like as a child, Johnny?" His parents had said he'd ask questions about me for about 10 minutes and then tell me to go, so I remained vigilant. I explained to him how I was mostly happy as a child, but didn't have many friends. "Why do you think you didn't have many friends?" I noticed his theme continuing. "Well, because I wasn't really interested in most people." Continued for a while talking about my youthful troubles and then suddenly sensed it was too much. "Oh, I don't do any of that," James said. I asked him what he was like when he was younger. I don't know." I thought I heard an ounce of a crying tone in his voice, a sort of deep cry of aloneness and detachment from this world. "I don't know," I quickly discovered, would be his immediate answer to most questions, followed sometimes by an answer, but still it seemed like an effort for him to put words together, and this taught me not to ask too many questions. James continued to stare out of the large window, forehead occasionally touching the glass, belly on display to the neighbours, to whom I imagined it providing something of a diversion in this quiet and reserved neighbourhood. As I watched him, I realised James was fully aware in the moment, and I was with him. We were connecting. I had an acute sense of it, which gave me a spacious sensation. But the price for him of this hyper-awareness was deep existential struggle. Unprepared for this world, heavy with its concepts, restrictions, expectations, and old stories. A child or adult living fully, unwittingly in the moment is poor in survival skills. Something in me wanted to know him personally by talking, but why when I knew it would cause him stress? When I continued with his own topic, he would say, "Yeah, that as well," as if he was vocalizing immediacy in the workings of his mind. Something like, "Yes, Johnny, so you're now adding more words to the experience." Keeping more and more quiet for us, I felt a sudden flash of awareness of the unique man in front of me, contrasting sharply with years of accumulated information in the formal studying of autism. Do you know any celebrities? He came and sat on a chair next to me, squeezing and stroking his whole naked belly. We now talked music. I learned he has singing lessons, and to my surprise, he sang for me a few heartfelt words from Another Brick in the Wall. I almost sang along. Our mostly comfortable silences were getting longer between the chatter. Silence and space were of equal importance to the verbal and physical aspects of our connection. I felt a certain reverence, for here was someone who was not of this world, which made this both personal and impersonal. There was a sensation I was in the presence of a cosmic phenomenon, an ethereal mystery, which moved me. At the same time, in the context of becoming his potential carer, here was a struggling person. Nonetheless, James was a human who had already, perhaps long ago by omission of norms, had an elevation of being. That state of pure release that perhaps is driving everyone and everything about being human. There wasn't any idolizing on my part, rather a unification with a common soul. James had something incredibly important to impart to me and the world, something so raw and so honest about this being human. I think I'll go when I've drunk this, I offered. Go, yes, okay, that's fine. And he was gone first, out of the door. Sitting now by myself for a minute, cup still in hand, I felt the room quiver around me in response to our meeting. On the way home, as I reflected, feeling quite emotional, and resting later behind my closed eyes, I had the sensation of floating in space. And there with me was James.